The majority of South America's nations speak Spanish, with the notable exception of Brazil, and those of you who are real nerds like me will know that there are a few countries in the north of the continent which also speak different languages, like Guyana, French Guiana, and Suriname, as well as some of the islands, which I will neglect to mention in this video. But, of course, this is very different to Europe, where literally every region you enter there is arguably a language being spoken. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of languages, whereas in South America, the major languages, there are only a few. So in this video, I'd like to ask the question, why is this the case? What has led to South America's linguistic situation? So first of all, of course, we have indigenous populations, people who had the first peoples to enter the Americas over the Bering Strait, as is the commonly proposed theory. And these peoples all spoke related languages to one another, which are divided into several linguistic groups. So the largest of these still spoken today would be Quechua. Now Quechua is a blanket term for a group of languages which can further be divided, and it was the language spoken by the Incas, who had a large empire at around the 15th, 16th century when the Spanish arrived, and thus Quechua is spoken in that region of sort of Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, that area. Now as well, you have a language group called the Guarani, which is another language group widely spoken in sort of central South America, in Paraguay, northern Argentina, Uruguay, that sort of area. Now in more Central America, in the Yucatan Peninsula, you have the Mayan language family, which is spoken there, as well as Nahuatl, which is slightly more to the north, although there aren't as many speakers of these as there are of Quechua and Guarani and other languages in that area. Now in the area of Brazil, in the Amazon rainforest, the main linguistic group there is called the Tupi linguistic group, which is also the name, a sort of blanket name given to a lot of the tribes. Now in the north, east of the continent, you have the Carib languages, which are being spoken by the Carib tribes, also where we get the etymology of the word Caribbean. It's all named after the tribe in that region, as well as the Arawak living more into the northern Amazon rainforest, and other groups in the south in areas like Chile and southern Argentina, speaking their own language groups there. Now in Peru today, if we look at the status of indigenous languages in South America, Quechua is co-official with Spanish, as is Aymara, and also other indigenous languages, of course smaller language groups not as large as Quechua and Aymara, which are two of the larger ones. Now Bolivia as well, Quechua is official, as well as Aymara, and Tupi-Guarani, so I'm guessing in the more Amazonian areas which are being spoken, is also official, so completely official in Bolivia. In Paraguay, Guarani is official. In Colombia, the indigenous languages are official in the territories in which they are spoken, and in Ecuador we have the fact that Quechua is official there, as well as another language called Shua. Now in Brazil, to sort of put in perspective how many people speak these indigenous languages and the kind of demographics involved, there of 210 languages in Brazil, 180 are indigenous. Of course, when you have linguistic groupings like in Europe, which is why I compared it, over time you get many more languages because groups divide into smaller groups, and then they sort of have dialects. This starts from accents, they interact with different groups, and before long you have your own language. Now this is a bit hard to define a language, but essentially there are 180 indigenous languages in Brazil, whereof less than 40,000 people speak indigenous languages in Brazil, and the population is around 208 million. So it really puts things into perspective when you view it like that. So moving on, of course, the big language in South America that everyone tends to think of is Spanish, and of course this language came from Spain. The year 1492 is very important to the Spanish because it's the year that the last Moorish stronghold in the city of Granada in the very south of Spain was finally retaken, and the Reconquista officially came to an end. Of course, 1492 is also the famous year in which Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Now Christopher Columbus was obviously an Italian from, I believe it was Genoa, but he was working for the Spanish, and with his discovery of the islands off the coast of South America, it led to the discovery and the colonization of the New World. And the first people to get involved in this were the Spanish, because he was working for them. And this for a while made the Spanish the most powerful nation and the largest nation on Earth. So of course this was hugely important, and as well this will be hugely important for the linguistic history of South America. The largest native empires and confederations of city-states to fall to the Spanish, and as well as being the first, were peoples like the Aztecs, the Incas and the Mayas. And with the conquests of these, more and more people from Spain came over to inhabit the lands. Of course they had to govern the lands and to take the riches from them, which made the Spanish incredibly rich, especially as these native peoples had been hoarding and making very precious items of gold and silver and other precious materials, which is of course where the first Spanish people arrive into South and Central America, bringing with them their language. Now, as well as bringing with them their language, they also brought African slaves to work on the plantations, because they found that smallpox and the native inhabitants didn't really mix incredibly well, and it's thought that anywhere from about 60% to 90% of the native populations might have died of invasive diseases that the conquistadors brought with them. So of course they had to bring in other people to work the plantations to harvest new crops, such as sugarcane, for example. And as well, they brought with them their own African languages, so then you get a mixture in South America of Spanish being spoken by the new rulers, the native languages that were obviously spoken there before and continued to be spoken by their descendants, and African languages being spoken by slaves brought onto the plantation, which adds in a very diverse and interesting mix of different tongues to make the new language that would be spoken in South America, at least in part. And of course, we then have the fact that in South America, the majority of South American countries, they speak Spanish as well as in Spain, but differences have arisen, which I find is very interesting when some nation colonizes another place and then the language slowly drifts further and further apart, because of course linguistic influence on Spain isn't necessarily a linguistic influence on South America and vice versa. So some of the differences would be, one of the things I notice as someone who speaks a basic level of Spanish, is the difference between the pronunciation of C and Z, which are kind of more like a th in Castilian Spanish from Spain. So for example, the verb to do, hacer, is pronounced like that, or the verb to organize is organizar, there the C and the Z being the th sound. Whereas in South America, they're much more likely to say hacer and organizar, because they use the S. And interestingly enough, this is a feature that is also found in the southern variant of Castilian Spanish, spoken in Andalusia, which they say Andalusia, because they have the more S kind of pronunciation, probably thanks to the Arabic influence of the Moorish invasion I mentioned earlier. So that's one huge difference between Spanish spoken in South America and Spanish spoken in Spain. Although of course South America has a huge host of accents and variants. So when I'm saying this is a feature of South American Spanish doesn't actually exist. It's just lots of different dialects and versions, as well as Spanish from Spain, the general trend that I've picked up on, as well as using words that are much more inspired by Arabic, as well as just older words in general. Languages that are overseas in colonies tend to be more conservative. So for example, English in America, the USA today, they use the word fall. Now fall is an older Germanic word for autumn, whereas in Great Britain the word went out of use and they started using the more French-derived autumn for the season, whereas in America they still say fall. Or for example, in South Africa, in Afrikaans, they use a lot more older sort of spelling types and sentence structure as the Dutch used in the 17th century, whereas in the Netherlands things have moved on a bit more. Languages and colonies, my point is, that tend to be slightly more conservative. And alcoba is related to alcove, which came into English from Arabic, and alcoba is used a lot more in the south of Spain as well, because of Andalusia and the Arabic influence there with the Moors. So that's a difference, whereas in Spain they're much more likely to say habitación, which is kind of room. Now as well, you have words like pronunciation differences. So the double L in Spanish is silent. So in Spain they would say me llamo, whereas in certain South American countries and dialects they're much more likely to say something like me llamo or me llamo. And this is something I've noticed in Andalusian Spanish, they do that as well. So again, you've got a different linkage there, as well as the words concha and chaqueta mean very different things in Spain. In Spain, a concha is a conch shell and a chaqueta is a jacket, whereas in South America, well, they mean something very different. Okay, so then we also have the Portuguese, who inhabited and colonized certain parts of South America, famously, of course, as you will expect, Brazil. Now, Brazil, when they came to Brazil, actually the name is also thought to have a Portuguese etymology from the pau Brasil, which is Portuguese, and I hope you get the pronunciation there, for Brazil wood. And this colonization of Portugal, of Brazil, started around 1500. Spain and Portugal were very close, so it was no surprise that when the Spanish were colonizing parts of South America, the Portuguese would want to get involved in the action as well. And that's why Brazil today is a Portuguese-speaking country. The reason it's named after a tree is because a lot of the time the Tupi, who were natives, and if you remember one of the language families spoken in Brazil, were selling the Brazil wood fir, or not the fir, what I'm on about, this is tree, timber, that's the one, timber, to the Europeans Europeans who came to trade there, which they then sold for very high prices. So then, of course, the area where these trees came from, i.e. the Amazon, when it was still there, they sold them on, and that's why it became famous as the place you can go to get Brazil wood, which is interesting because it then might have a similar etymological history as Holland, because Holland means woodland, so it might be something similar to that, which is interesting. In the northeast of the country, English, French and Dutch colonizers started to set up plantations, which they then could use to make goods and to sell them on abroad in European markets. And these countries would eventually become known as British Guyana or Guyana, Dutch Suriname and French Guyana, because it's named after the plain called the Guyane Plain. And as well as the other linguistic situations in South America, the variants of Dutch, English and French spoken in the respective colonies and areas of jurisdiction that eventually became one British, one Dutch and one French were influenced by the native languages being spoken, mostly of the Carib and Arawak variants, as well as by African slaves who were brought in to work on these plantations. So you get an interesting linguistic and indeed ethnic mix in these countries of various people as well from the Indies, from Indonesia, that kind of area, natives and black Africans, as well as of course Europeans, although you won't find many Europeans left in these countries. Most of them left after they gained independence, well at least Guyana and Suriname did. French Guyana is still part of France at the moment. And these countries are still very close to their host nations, which is of course where they get their languages, which are still the official languages in these countries today. So for example, Guyana is part of the Commonwealth today, which is linked to Great Britain and the United Kingdom. As well, Suriname is, the Dutch military is responsible for the protection of Suriname at the moment, and there are still close diplomatic and economic ties between the two countries, which then continues the use of the Dutch language in Suriname. And finally, in French Guyana, that's not actually the flag because it's technically an overseas district of France, so it's technically still part of the French Empire, if you can call it that. So then you obviously get the very closeness of language between mainland France and this colony in South America. So thank you very much for watching. This has been my video on the linguistic situation in South America. Why the actually it's interesting because the majority of people in South America speak Portuguese, because Brazil has by far the largest population. Whereas Spanish is the most widespread language being spoken in the majority of South American countries, with the obvious exception of the northern few, as well as the Falklands, which I neglected to mention until the end of this video because I'm almost out of here and I'm almost safe. Anyway, so I hope you've enjoyed this video. Do give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Check out some of my other videos if you think you're interested. And yeah, don't forget to tune in again next time.